Hi, this is Paul, and I wanted to make a video talking about some of the things that were in this excellent conversation between Karen and Karl and Ira. I probably owe Karl a conversation because Karl's been so present on the Randos channel and on Karen's channel, and Karl's got so many interesting things to say, and Karl's been so active in the comments section, and he's given me so much good stuff via the comments that I probably owe him a conversation one of these days, so I'm sure that will happen. But this conversation between Karen and Karl and Ira, I thought was simply outstanding. It was just a nerdy conversation, like so many of these conversations where it's on Austrian economics and libertarian politics and engineering and French culture, and it's all over the map, but it was really tremendous and heartful and humble, and all of like so many of the wonderful conversations that I've really feel so gratified to have had a part in at least getting out there into the world. Now Karl, almost right from the start, has been on me. That's going to be the next slide, actually, about complicated and complexity, and so he really forced me to go looking at these things and to think a lot about that. I'm very grateful for that. And along the way, obviously, there's been a lot of questions about God number one. God number one is sort of the form below, organized structural processes built into creation. And Karl has noted that in my videos, I've laid out again and again a view from below for the reality and the credibility of at least the God idea. And in many ways, I'm sort of following in the wake of Jordan Peterson in that. And I'm doing that partly because I believe that Jordan Peterson's work on this has been a critical element of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, which has been a lot of people being helped, a lot of people then being able to find their way into churches, and maybe not even all the way into churches like Karl. Karl hasn't gone there yet, but into at least conversations where so many of the ancient assumptions that created the amazing world that we live in persisted in the world. And now Karen expressed in this conversation some tension that she has. Now I could talk about that other side of it too. Again, back in 2006, 2007, Tim Keller was doing a lot of sermons and lessons on Christianity versus religion, and I can very much talk that line too, because I think there are some ways that Christianity is very much a religion, and some ways that Christianity inverts religion. And I think this is part of the reason I've been enjoying so much Rene Girard lately, because I think Girard puts some of these pieces together in a very interesting way, both Christianity and Judaism as religion, but especially the ways in which Jesus Christ inverts religion in some interesting ways. And so, I probably owe Karen another conversation too. I should probably swing back around and do some more conversations with Karen and Mary and Job and Jeff and Luke and a bunch of these other guys. I had Dr. Jim on last week, which was really just a remarkable, wonderful conversation that we had. So Karl, basically looks at a lot of my videos and says, well, I've been making a strong case for God, let's say in quotation marks, similar to what the case that Jordan Peterson has made, that the idea of God is essential for the well-being of society. And as Karl notes, that doesn't necessarily lead himself to think about God as an active agent, God as a person, God as the organizing spirit of everything that is and of everything that's good. And so that's something I'll continue to be talking about. And Karl's not alone in that. There are many others, including Job, a number of others who have talked to me that have said very similar things. And I reflect on the fact that I think part of this is simply due to our secular culture, that in many ways the ease with which I can believe in God and participate in church has so much to do with my parents and how I was raised, And I'm just very comfortable with this. And for many who have either had bad experiences in church or lifeless experiences with church or no experience in church, this way of thinking has not necessarily been patterned into them. And as I've said in a number of times, there are a lot of people for whom a remarkable experience could be something that happens via psychedelics or something that happens. I've known a number of people for whom God just comes upon them. They didn't take any drugs or anything. They were at home in their bed or in a chair or someplace, and God just comes upon them. And from that point on, they believe and have absolutely no question or doubt about the reality of God. But again, Karl is noting the line of distinction between person. And again, as I listen to conversations and I look at how people label themselves and the lines of demarcation they wish to draw, especially in this secular realm where people are very interested in noting they are non-theistic. They might not be atheistic, but they're non-theistic. They might not be anti-theists. Adam Friended often makes that point, but they're not theists, and their line of demarcation is, I don't believe in anything supernatural. And I think that's something we need to look quite a bit more closely at, because, well, I think there's a lot going on there, and I'm going to get into some of that in this video. And so I'm going to swing around to this question, which I keep coming back to again and again. It has everything to do with the supernatural. It has everything to do with theism, as the question of what do we mean by this strange word, person, and how do these things scale? And that's why I'm using the word fractals here in this slide. How do these things scale up and scale down? Now, Karl again has talked about complicated versus complex, and here in this conversation where they talk about economics and they talk about what is a market, I think, again, we bump into these ideas in many of the disciplines. René Girard, in his conversations with David Cayley, has a very interesting passage where Girard complains about the siloing of the disciplines in the academy. And I suspect that René Girard is absolutely right about that. Now, one of the things that I've grown to appreciate in an ecclesiastical, in a church context, is that there is no siloing. As a pastor, I get to flit around a number of things. Now, there is siloing in the Christian academy, biblical studies, systematic studies, pastoral care. Many of the classic loci, even within systematics, can become silos. But I've had the opportunity to integrate and think freely, and I think this is part of the reason, part of what's been so enjoyable about my experience over the last 2 years of this emergent community. Well, use that word. This emergent community that we've had of Christians and non-Christians, people, engineers and cognitive scientists and icon carvers and psychologists and artists and pastors and coders and people painting, blue-collar workers, truck drivers, all of us contributing together in conversations that where we can cross all of these lines and try and knit things together, because we don't live our lives in these silos, and that's part of the joy about being a pastor, because I'm a generalist. So let's play some of this. Let's play some of this conversation, and Karl's going to lay out again the difference between complicated and complex with respect to market. And well, let's get into the conversation.
The bigger picture to me was, and of course I mentioned this several times with Karen, and we talked about this when I first talked to her, but was the failure to distinguish between complicated systems and complex systems. Yeah, right. So the Keynesians see the economy as like an engine or a clock, and if you tweak this knob, this rheostat, you can then which typically are like interest rates or put money in the system, then you can very accurately, or maybe not as accurately as a very precise Swiss clockwork, but at least to some extent you could say if I tweak the interest rate this way, the economy will grow at 3%. And if I do this, and if it doesn't, then I can inject money in the system, and I can borrow money, and I can all these things, and we will have a very predictable result. And it's a completely wrong picture of what an economy is. Because an economy is truly, a really excellent example of what a complex system is. It's the interaction of many, many parts that actually, when put together, is more than the sum of each individual part. And that it creates an order. So there is still order. It's not anarchy, like Marx would say, it's the anarchy of the market. On the contrary, the market is one of the most orderly things, as long as it's not interfered with too much,
Now, right there is interesting, because there's sort of a Karl's working of his definition of complex. Complex, I've discerned two competing definitions within his definition. One is that complex is something that creates more than the sum of its parts. Now, I would say complicated systems do that too, in a sense that a car engine is complicated, and in a certain sense it creates more than just the sum of its parts. Maybe not, maybe differ with that. But the second one, in reading this distinction in business sites and other places on the internet, is that they would note that part of the difference is that in a car engine, there are all these different moving parts. And in a sense, it's a zero-sum game. But complex systems are full of people. And economies are full of people. And there was actually a very interesting conversation that Eric Weinstein did on his Portal podcast. I think it was the third one, where it talked about false signaling within people and systems and societies, and that was a fascinating conversation. That, along with Daniel, he was on Rebel Wisdom. See, I think about these things mid talking, and then I don't bother to go look them up. But a lot about communal cognizance, and he has a long last name, a German last name, which is hard to pronounce. But that was really a tremendous video too, that interview that Rebel Wisdom had done with him, about all of the ways that the thing about part about a complex system is that the internal components are watching each other. If you look at the stock market, the reason the stock market is so complex, and the stock market is a great example of a market, is that everybody's watching each other. In other words, everybody's gaming each other. Everybody is trying to second guess each other, and this is why people try to have these static systems, like Karl says, where we're going to do these things and we're going to get these desired outcomes, sort of like a car engine. But not in a market, because there are all these active agents, we would say all these persons watching each other, employing rationality in order to achieve outcomes. And in a thing like a market, there's both people working together and people competing in terms of a market, and they're trying to earn more money. And if they can cooperate in order to earn more money, they do that together. Then there are rules about that, no insider trading, and they will compete in order to get more money. And so again, a market is a delicious example of what Karl is trying to say. Partly because it's so filled with people, and yet there is order to it. We have a sense of the desires of the people and the rationality of the people, and these market actors are doing rational things. But then, as that Eric Weinstein Portal mentioned, also not doing rational things. Recently someone won a Nobel Prize for noting how irrational people are in markets, and we notice this in political markets as well. So a market is a wonderful example of a complex system. Let's go on.
Oh, that's the big thing. But it creates its own order and finds its own equilibrium from within.
Okay, now this is the self-ordering thing that John Vervaeke talks about often, that, a tornado is self-ordering, and we find things out in the world that are self-ordering. Now most of us would note that would not this gets really difficult when we don't forget about Jonathan Peugeot, because to what degree does a market have a personality? And there are to what degree does we call it a bear market or a bull market, and we call it that because in a sense we personify these two animals, and so we in a sense create a principality. Now most of us would say that a market isn't a person. A market is not willfully attempting to do something. Markets are blind, and they care not for who wins and who loses. The market doesn't look down and say, well, Berkshire Hathaway, we want them to keep winning, and we want Bill Gates to keep winning in the market, and the titans of the new information technology industry. I mean, the market isn't picking winners and losers like that. In a sense, there's this faux personification that we can't help but employ when we talk about markets as agents as such. Yet most of us culturally or intuitively don't call markets persons because they're not willfully selecting outcomes and rationally employing various degrees of power to achieve them. But yet markets in some ways look a lot like persons. Now, I forgot to put this article in when I was there's a terrific piece, and again, I get this stuff from so many of you who leave comments in. I can't get to all the comments always, but I try to read them when I can. Slate Star Codex, who is just a brilliant blogger, had this wonderful piece back in July of 2014 on meditations on Molech, and it's very long, but it's a very worthwhile read as he talks about systems and persons within systems, and how these systems are brutal and unkind. Now again, we're using words here that we don't track with impersonal things, but we can't help but do it. And this is where I get into some of the second conversation that I had with John Vervaeke, the script I sort of ran out in terms of how it is actually very appropriate for us to personify markets and personify even complicated elements so that we can, that's the spirit of finesse is the better spirit with which we interact with these things. We have Group A and Group B. And in many ways, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, how we theorize these complicated or complex systems is important because of how we interact with some of them. We very much say we interact with a market. If you can pull out a little app like Robinhood and start trading things on your phone almost immediately, and you're interacting with the market. And as Karl notes, one of the things that we do is that we interact with this market, and the market is full of human interactions. Now we're going to talk about free markets, because then at some point we're going to ask, well, if the markets very much, as C.S. Lewis makes the comment in his book Miracles, if the markets very much accommodate all of these different little traders, how can we as human beings make markets unfree? Make markets unfair. Now, all of us know we can make markets unfair. We believe that. And so, in fact, the Federal Exchange Commission has all of these rules and all of these laws in order to keep the market free. Now the presence of this interdynamic between them is something to really think through in this conversation, because what are we saying with respect to persons? That this market is highly complex because it's full of all of these agents, and they're not just acting as rational agents. You might say, well, computer trading might be rationalized agents, but it's the rationality of the programmer that's built into the program, so that program becomes the tool. But of course, what people are always doing is playing point, counterpoint, spy versus spy, trying to one way or another employ rationality or deceptiveness, or to see even bullshitting themselves sometimes in order to try to get ahead in this marketplace. So I think this is a wonderful conversation and a wonderful example to get at this question of, well, how do we approach God? And part of this is interesting because markets are not only personified, markets are in effect deified. And many of us might learn something if we think about, why do we deify markets? And why do we approach markets as if they are gods? What does that say about us? What does that say about the God habits that have been built into us from hundreds of generations in the past of religious people acting in certain way towards certain things out there? Now, again, rationalists imagine, well, we're going to see through this. Well, see through it all you want in your office, but put the Robinhood app in your hand and have the lure of money or wealth or riches or opportunity or the threat of bankruptcy or economic devastation of your family, and your rationality goes out the window pretty quickly. Casinos are experts at manipulating us in these ways. And so, these are powers and forces that are beyond us, and it's not unexpected or unreasonable that we deify markets. It might be idolatrous, but it's not unreasonable.
From the sum total of all these various interactions that each interaction is very local.
Or in a very technical sense, and this is one of the big things goes on and on in the human action and Rothbard after that, is it's never in equilibrium, actually. It's one of the big fallacy.
Well, that's correct. Okay. That's a good thing that you... Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out, because when I say equilibrium, I mean, it's not an equilibrium in the sense of a long-term equilibrium. It's just, at any point, of course, there is something close to an equilibrium. You're absolutely right. It's never really an equilibrium.
Now this is interesting too, because are markets in equilibrium? How do markets go through time? Excuse me. How do markets go through time? Not only do we deify markets, but we employ them. We use them, we believe in them, we trust them, we also protect them, we cultivate them, we create them. They are creatures of our hand, yet by design they go beyond us, and that's exactly what we want from them.
There's always innovation, there's always changes, there's always
well, there always has to be a little
very dynamic. It's a very dynamic system.
Right? In any complex system, there always has to be a little randomness that keeps it from solidifying.
Okay, now this is a point that Karen makes a lot. And if you've watched any of Karen's videos, you know why. Because Karen is an artist. You can see some of her art behind her. And she has a website, and she sells her art. And Karen's also a wonderful person and a wonderful Christian. But Karen, in her... She in terms of maps of meaning, she very much got into the idea of anomaly. And that's Jordan Peterson's talking about anomaly and got her interested, because the way in which she does her art, she looks for the randomness, she looks for the anomaly, and then she, in a sense, lets the anomaly create the beauty and the idiosyncratic nature of the art. And so she, in a sense, is sort of like her art process, in my mind, is sort of like the way we use randomness in programming computer games. Now, lately, I've been playing a lot of Civilization 6 with my son Jared, and he always beats me. But I have fun playing. I have fun playing Civ with my son Jared. Anyway, and we play these long games that go on for days and days and days, and it's great fun. But how does the computer approximate randomness, and why does the computer approximate randomness? Because randomness is interesting to us, because we're very much pattern seekers, and what randomness actually are the limits of our pattern seeking. And so I've played before a video that you can find on YouTube about randomness, where they look at, the motion of electrons, and they look for something that is way beyond our ability, something out in nature that is way beyond our ability to predict. And then we begin at that starting point for anomaly or randomness, and then build a system upon that. And the reason we build a system upon that is because otherwise, the starting points that we select are from our minds, and we're very patterned and organized, and people who guess their own passwords or come up with their own passwords for their bank account and some of this, they don't pick good passwords, which is why we have LastPass, and this video brought to you by LastPass. LastPass and all these other password organizing entities, corporations and tools that we use in order to modify it. And there have been some interesting things that I've read recently where in some ways some people look at divination of like reading bird bones and tea leaves and some of this in order to, in a sense, randomize our intuitions to get us out of our patterns to see different patterns. If you go all the way back to the beginning of John Vervaeke's long video series and he talks about shamanism, very similar things, that in some ways in order for us to see the world more clearly, we have to break our perceptual patterns and look at the world through other ways so that we can actually have interactions with the world. And if you look at my Sunday school lesson, I introduced a little bit of Jordan Peterson thinking into there when Peterson notes that so often we know the truth better when we bump into something we don't expect, because what we're constantly doing is we're projecting our patterns out into the world. And so when something comes back at us that disrupts our patterns, if we have the honesty not to just simply stay in denial and confuse ourselves and just stay in our own little wrapped dream and bubble, but actually interact with that thing which is breaking the pattern, then in fact we might learn something. Okay, and that's part of psychologizing in markets and all of this. So Karen often notes there needs to be randomness in the process, and I think part of that randomness is because we have the mapped and unmapped territory that we're always dealing with. But I think it's important for us to deconstruct randomness, because generally speaking, we look at randomness sort of as an ontological category, and another way to look at randomness is, in fact, randomness is the limits of our pattern recognition. And beyond that, we don't know. We don't know if there is another pattern that we are unable to discern or not. We don't know if there is intentionality behind that we are unable to discern. What we're bumping into with a lot of the cognitive science, and as we get into the American Pragmatists a little bit later in this video, is the fact that at some point we have to acknowledge the limits of our perception and the limits of our capacity and the limits of our ability to understand. You actually find this in the Psalms. These things are too wonderful for me to know. Well, what do I mean wonderful? I mean they can be too complicated, or they can be too complex for me to know. And markets are like that. And so part of the reason I think we in the West have had so much faith in markets, and you can hear many others make this point, it's that the world is just too big and too complex, full of human beings, for us to manage, and therefore we sort of create these things called markets, and markets are, in fact, a mixture of order and chaos. There's the order set by the rules of the market, and this is what we mean by now it's ironic that we say a free market, but a free market is only a free market when it's within rules. Now go back and read that meditation to Molech on Slate Star Ledger, Slate Star Codex, because that piece very much gets into these questions and asks some very dissonance creating and disturbing questions about why gods, why Molech, why spirits, and we can very much say why markets. Now again, I'm speaking from below, and so this won't bother Karl, but the difficulty that we have is the presumption that we can make assertions beyond the complexity that we see. Now I think there's more good stuff coming in this video, so I'll play a little bit more.
Yeah, so we talked about this on our talk last time. That's absolutely true. But so, to me, it boils down to, and I think that's the confusion between complexity and mere complication is the cause of a lot of misunderstandings in the world. And I think one of the authors more recently that has been very excellent at pointing this out is Nassim Taleb, right? So the author.
All right, I'll leave it here. They go into Nassim Taleb and how he doesn't like Jordan Peterson, and that's all fine and good. Why does it need preserving? What in fact I would argue, because there's a funny way in which markets are both wild, but we have a sense of when markets are completely wild, they break down into monopolies. Well, why? What? Because of people and agents. So in other words, there are all these, the need to keep markets free. Now, if you look at the last Democratic debate, one of the debates is, okay, should we break up Google and Facebook and the big companies? Now, Andrew Yang made the point, and I think it's a very good point. Well, you could do that, but that was something that was really helpful in breaking up, let's say, railroads or AT&T and establishing new competition. I'm not saying that isn't a tool that could be used, but we should think about the environment a good deal and see if these new types of corporations and these new types of technologies are really analogous to railroads and public utilities and the old AT&T, the old Ma Bell. So there's a lot going on here. And what's interesting is that this meddling and preserving isn't not the meddling of billions of individuals that create market. Yeah, that's in fact what markets are there to accommodate. What person as state then makes markets unfree? What agent as state? Now what exactly is the right language to understand the unfreedom of market? Do not markets in a sense fractal up? And once, well, you've got all these individuals operating, and well, no, there's no insider trading. And so what markets in a sense are doing is recognizing human individuality, and markets are anxious about superhuman entities like states that in a sense are these human beings fractaling up into principalities that actually get large enough to compete with markets. And we go back to the 2008 recession and the question about too big to fail. There's lots and lots and lots of stuff going on here. But when we get down to sort of the philosophical question about persons and actors and agents and what in fact is required to keep a market free, and why in fact do we want to do that when free markets, sort of like the weather, can cause devastation and havoc, and then what types of, the government comes in to bail out. Well, why bail out banks and not bail out, all the people who lost their homes, and, so on and on we go with these things. But again, this gets back to the question about what is a person, and does it fractal or scale, and how, when it scales, when we have Uncle Sam working in the market, we say, well, that market is no longer free because the principality of Uncle Sam is messing with the market. While the person of Paul Vanderklay, the market is not disturbed at all. Well, it's because Paul Vanderklay doesn't have a lot of money. But I remember back in the day when the Hunt brothers tried to corner the market on silver. Well, Well, there you had persons who, well, what were they scaling up? Well, they had platforms and businesses, and they had these, in a sense, superhuman things that they were creating that amplified. Now, what did they do? They amplified their will, and I think that might be a piece of it, that this amplification of the will, and then you have the question, well, how does will scale? And in what ways should will not scale? In what ways, when will scales, is it a distortion? You'll find this question behind many, many questions in politics and ethics and economics and quite frankly, all over the place. Now here's a definition of person that I thought of this morning. I'll just throw it out there. A person is conscious, and by what we mean by conscious, aware beyond itself of real things. I think a conscious will is something that can have meaningful interaction. A conscious will is something that has, in a sense, a plane of awareness. A conscious will is something that can have, as I said earlier, bump into the dissonance creating truth that forces the rest of the person to reassess and recalibrate and reorganize their internal mapped representation of the world. That is a critical element of personhood. A person is willful. It desires, it wants something. And we often use this, well, the market wants, well, what does the market want? Why do we personify the market in that way? It employs reason or rationality. Now, what do I mean by that? That what do I mean by rationality? That it does pattern recognition, it does prediction, and that prediction and pattern recognition is combined with power and will, so that it not only seeks outcomes but attempts to secure outcomes through whatever power it has to influence its environment. Okay, I think person will have those three elements in it. And again, this is just a definition I thought up this morning, but I've been noodling this for quite a while. What is a person? What is a person? Well, how can we make distinctions between persons? And now we're going to run into the question of random here, though, too, because just as with random, there are limits to our perception, and if we don't own those limits, if we don't own those limits, we'll get things wrong. And so what we should do then with those limits is acknowledge them, but then realize that, as in my conversation with John Vervaeke, where I say, we treat mysterious, complex, even complicated things as persons, and we do so rightly, we do so ethically, and we do so with wisdom, because that is in fact how human beings should relate to things greater than themselves. And so rather than disparage or feel superior to our ancestors who treated the world with far more respect and in fact with a lot more personification and lived as if they lived in a very enchanted place, that's probably a very helpful strategy. Now, it's so interesting when I watch Alone. That's one of the few TV shows that I watch, Alone on the History Channel. You find these people out by themselves in the woods talking to cameras, trying to survive. Usually it's really the starvation game. That's what hunger is. And they're one way or another to get food out of a very nutrient poor environment in very desperate situations, and this is what I watch for entertainment. But watch how they personify everything, and I think in our contemporary culture we're so prideful. We despise others for doing this, when in fact I think take away all our gadgets and throw us up into the Arctic for 3 months and see how we do. I had a lovely conversation with Sarah about the enchanted world and the loss of the enchanted world. Now, there are dynamics at play in here, but treating the world in an enchanted way, I think, is actually a very savvy strategy for small, not terribly bright, creatures such as ourselves in order to make our way in the world. There's a good bit of really smart relevance realization built into that. And I think the cultural habit we have of disparaging people for that, I think, is not only rude and ungracious towards fellow human beings, but it's probably also misguided. We're a little bit full of ourselves, and it could be that the high degrees of anxiety and depression and suicide are a result of that cultural habit. So there's a three-element definition of person. Again, I'm just sketching this out. I just thought of it this morning. A person has consciousness, a person is willful, and a person employs reason or rationality. And it's distinct from, say, something like self-organizing, something like a tornado or a marketplace, to the best of our knowledge. Even a tornado, I mean, I challenged, in one video, I challenged a woman who, you know, I shared Brett Weinstein's example of this people group that had a religion that basically said, you know, when the spirit in the water retreats like that, you should run to the hills. That's a very scientific way of approaching the world, by the way. And how do you know there's not a spirit in the water? I mean, you can't know that one way or another with our tools. You're not going to pull up a bucket of water and look at it and say, is there spirit in here? That's just as simple-minded and straw-manish as sending the Russian up into orbit for the first time and saying, we didn't find God's palace at the top of the firmament. Okay, well, we understand a few things about how language works and our representations and how symbolism works and how all of these things work. So to the best of our knowledge, we'll put that, distinctly self-organizing systems like tornadoes or markets or even governments or the future. You know, Jordan Peterson's observation that we sacrifice to the future, and we he didn't exactly say it this way, but this was in his Easter 2017 video that was taken down from his from his YouTube channel. But that we interact with the future via sacrifice as person, as in a sense as God, and we do so. That's a very savvy, smart way to do it. Partly because, and this again is a justification from below, partly because the future is so full of persons. Okay? And so now you can begin to sense my God number one and God number two going here. So we're distinguishing it from distinctly self-organizing systems. Now, I watched a video with Richard Rorty that I put the link to it. Jim recommended it and put it in the links, and then I watched it. And there's a sound video in that. The sound issue in that video is filmed in like 2000. But that was really interesting. That was a really interesting little talk given by Richard Rorty. And Rorty is a pragmatist. And that kind of sent me back to the Metaphysical Club. And I had first time through the Metaphysical Club, at least mostly through the Metaphysical Club, you bump into this character named Chauncey Wright. Very interesting guy. You know, he's just the sort of guy who'd be watching YouTubes with all of us and showing up at my meetup. And, you know, the guy didn't, you know, wasn't much in terms of organizing his own life, but he lived for conversation. Maybe he should be the patron saint of the conversation with a Z on the random channels. And so, you know, if you haven't picked up, this is one of the books in Jordan Peterson's recommended reading list, The Metaphysical Club. It's really an interesting book about pragmatism and why pragmatism arose. And he had this idea that basically the weather is just complicated. So, Karl, you might want to take a look at this book. Weather is just complicated, not complex, because he asserts, now, again, how you can validate this assertion. In fact, he himself would say he couldn't. He acts as if weather is complicated, not complex. That it's just a highly complicated system and is not made up of persons or nymphs or gods or conscious beings decided, I'm going to blow this hurricane through Houston right now. And this is, in fact, again, always the crux of the matter. Every time there's a tsunami or a hurricane and there's great loss of life, and, well, to what degree is God, number two, a willful agent responsible? Now the Bible pretty much keeps God on the hook for all of that. And that's something that a lot of American evangelicals, especially, I think, I think in many ways the Calvinist Arminian free will versus kind of this Calvinist determinism debate, this is a result of, again, the philosophical waves moving through much more than the question of what's in the Bible, because the stuff in the Bible obviously was written before all of those philosophical waves made their way through it. So here's the question: is the weather complex or complicated? Well, most of us would say it's complicated. Well, and this gets into sort of my group A and group B, because persons are sort of like these little black boxes, and these black boxes that are making decisions. Now, our spirit of geometry continues to penetrate the black box, but it could be that, sort of like calculus, there are infinite points between 0 and 1. There could be infinite levels to this black box. And again, a lot of Vervaeke's mechanisms, I think, have been helpful for me in this, understanding combinatorial explosion, understanding my argument, why God is the frame of frames. So anyway, so Chauncey Wright, again, the chapter on Wright, just interesting guy, fascinating. Would have loved to have known him. Kind of a sad story in the end, but a very interesting guy. And this is what he writes about. We accept this that the weather is complicated and not complex. We accept this state of affairs about the weather. Now, Wright here is a computer. What do you say? Wright's a computer. What do you mean by that? Well, a computer, before that word was used for these machines, that word was used for mathematicians whose job it was to run the highly complicated algorithms that would predict things like the movement of the planets and so on and so forth. That was the job of computing, and people who computed for a living were called computers. Made perfect sense. Now, to call a person a computer would be socially a very different thing. So he was a computer. That's what he did for a living. He did about 3 months out of the year, and he was so good at it, he could get a year's worth of personal support done in 3 months and spend the rest 9 months having conversations with people. Like I said, this guy fit very well in one of our meetups. It talk. Okay. We accept the state of affairs about the weather, that it is a perfectly lawful, rather mundane phenomenon whose complexity, now they're not following Karl's rules of wording here in this book, so Karl, you'll have to, not get too upset about that. I think Karl will be fine with that. He seems like a pretty chill guy. I'm just going to read it as it's written, and you can buy your own copy and pencil it out and correct it if you want, like my mother-in-law did to her Bible. Rather mundane phenomena whose complexity nevertheless vastly exceeds our ability to understand it. And yet we freely pontificate about the causes of human unhappiness and the future progress of society, things determined by factors presumably many times more complex than the weather. So again, in a sense, he writes ideas about God or no God. I think Wright, being a thoroughgoing, one of the fathers of pragmatism, basically would say, we can't know. That's what he would say, I think. We can't know. But yet he did presume to know the nature of the world, that the world is finally simply complicated beyond our capacity to understand, sort of like we use the word random. Okay? So finally, that's the way the world is, but we're not going to figure it out because it's just plain too complicated. Now, and persons then, you've got group A and group B, everything would be group A for Chauncey Wright. Now, again, I did a little blog post about Group A and Group B. If you need a little refresher course, I'll put that link in the notes if I remember. And if I don't remember and you hear me say this and you notice it's not there, just leave a note in the comments and then I'll add it later because I'm not all that organized. And actually, this afternoon I fly, this evening I fly out to Portland. But by the time you see this, I will have already been back in Sacramento. So sorry, it's just some church work I have to do in Portland. Where was I? Okay. It would be too much to say that this inconsistency roused Chauncey Wright. He was not an excitable man, but it attracted his attention. He spent much of his career attempting to correct it. It is not, Wright believed, that every event is not completely determined by physical causes. It is just that precise knowledge of those causes and how they operate is inaccessible to science in its present state. There we get some scientific eschatology. And considering the multitude of factors, each with its own probability of occurrence, you get randomness, involved in producing the outcome of even the simplest events, such as flipping a coin, that knowledge will probably remain inaccessible. Thus, he thought, the scientific claims of historians like Buckle reduced to mere superstition. Statistical explanations of history are no different from the providential explanations they purport to displace. In other words, science is just another religion. They can't account for all their stuff. Religions basically just kick it all up into God and don't worry about it. That's Chauncey Wright's opinion. Statistical explanations of history are no different from the providential explanations they purport to displace. The interest is nearly the same whether the lesson be on divine providence or on the force of an inscrutable or irresistible fate, as he wrote in a review of a book by an American disciple of Buckle. So again, if you want more context, pick up the Metaphysical Club and read all about it. But this gets again into Group A and Group B. And Wright's assertion is that you're not going to answer this question. And the real sin of the celebrity atheist is presumption. That doesn't necessarily help Karl in his decision about whether or not he should attempt to relate to an all-seeing, all-powerful, all-caring being. The difficulty that one has, and or sort of stumble into something. I hate when I can't remember stuff in the middle of a podcast. Stumble into. Oh, why can't I think of his wager? You're all thinking about it. Maybe it's a better way to say it anyway. Not Descartes. It's the same guy. Finesse. Anyway, his wager. I'll think about it in a minute, but you've already thought about it, so you don't need to. Relevance realization, though, how far down? This is something that as I continue to think about relevance realization, to what degree, and I've mentioned this, does my thyroid have relevance realization? Do my kidneys have relevance realization? In other words, relevance realization is not an exclusive domain of persons. It can be a domain of persons, the persons that I've just described, but it isn't Pence's. I'm not going to think about that until I see his doggone name. Pascal. There it is. Pascal's wager. All right. Relevance realization. What a darn clever notion. I keep, relevance realization is sort of something like when you have a problem with your teeth and your tongue just keeps going to it and you just keep working that dumb thing. I had a crown fall out that I had to get replaced, and so I didn't have that crown in that one tooth that I had had a crown in before, and doggone it, your tongue would go there and your tongue would get all raw. And, relevance realization is like that. It's like, oh, doggone it, John Vervaeke, put that idea in my head and I'm going to gnaw on this sucker for a long time. It's, how far down relevance realization? Well, after I did my video on Peter Thiel, of course, then people start recommending other Peter Thiel videos to me, and someone recommended this video to me, and this was really a very good conversation, but I didn't know who Peter Thiel was talking to. William Hurlbut is a professor at Stanford School of Medicine, and so he's a doctor. And boy, I'm getting a lot of. We got Dr. Jim, we got John Madney up there in Montana, who had a conversation with. I love the doctors. Well, I think partly because doctors and pastors both are working. They're generalists often, but they're working the human problem from both sides in many ways. Doctors even more than pastors because they're much more scientists than pastors are. But what this guy says in this video just astounded me, and so I know it'd have to come into a video somewhere. But it gets to this question of, well, complexity or complicatedness, all the way down, very far down.
Astonishing advances in biomedicine through understanding the material mechanisms, mathematical modeling, so forth, have brought us amazing advances in putting into effect the Enlightenment dream, explicitly stated, as Peter said, by Francis Bacon and René Descartes. So now we have come to see all of living nature as mere matter and information.
There's the point that I'm making these faces because just the way that my little window cropped up, I'm right on this other guy's shoulders here, and so I just can't help but play. Anyway, it's for those of you listening, total distraction. Sorry about that. The point that Vervaeke makes in the meaning crisis, where we find ourselves alone, isolated in a disenchanted world. Everything around us is dead. And that's, of course, where the zombie thing comes up, because we suddenly begin to wonder if we're alive. I mean, there's probably a zombie movie out there that goes into the fact that someone's walking around the zombie world, not knowing they're a zombie. It's sort of zombie movie plus Sixth Sense. So, hey, if you're a movie maker and you make that movie, you heard it here first. You don't have to send me any money. Well, maybe you should. But anyway, but here we are. We're alone in this dead world. We imagine ourselves, especially once we kill off God. Well, it's just us. Well, you think that's not going to produce anxiety? Well, wait. And in fact, doing science isn't going to make us less anxious when we begin to recognize, in fact, what an unbelievably complicated or complex tower of things we're sitting upon. We, meaning this conscious autobiographer that lives and moves and has power and has concerns and will and all these things that persons have. I interrupt too much. This is great what he does here.
To be reached Descartes. So now we have come to see all of living nature as mere matter and information, to be reshuffled and reassigned in projects of the human will. We're ready, many of us, to entrust ourselves to the Google gods in the confidence that aging and even death may have a technological solution. William Hazeltine, founder of Genome Sciences, at the founding of the Society for Regenerative Medicine, commented, "The real goal is to keep people alive forever." Why not?
The person obviously never read Mere Christianity, but go on. Not him. I mean the person that said the real goal is to keep people alive forever. That's a pretty ironic statement in a culture where people are offing themselves at greater and greater rates. You have one group of people say, we don't want to die, and another people say, I can't die quick enough. What should that tell us?
Currently, our armamentarium of pharmaceuticals targets about 250 protein sites. There are an estimated 20,000 protein coding genes, which means there are thousands and thousands of protein sites yet untouched. What might be possible with all that? And certainly, as Peter said, it's unknown. What could happen? So we barely, if you think of technology as a continent, we've barely stepped off of Plymouth Rock. Yet, when we pause to consider more deeply this whole arena, it's clear that the advances that seem so dramatic to us of the 20th century were largely accomplished through kind of intelligible operations on the natural world. Sanitation, improved nutrition, very easy to understand targeting of external infectious agents operating on us.
Low-hanging fruit.
So this preserved a sense of the order of nature we were basically attacking those things which were impinging on us, not reworking the very center and core of ourselves, and therefore the biblical statement of life 70, or by reason of strength 80, can be said to be true still, except that we've got a little more advanced, and there are some people living, it seems like the maximal lifespan is about 115, 120. And by the way, it's interesting, look in Genesis 6:3, and it says that God proclaims that his spirit will dwell in human beings only to the 120 years. It's very quite fascinating. So what is going on here? Well, do we have the possibility of intervening to not just conquer terrible diseases, but to actually extend our lifespan dramatically more, and perhaps by some lights even conquer death itself? Well, if you look at the actual science undergirding all this, it's a little more complicated. We use these very simplistic models, the idea that like a car with replaceable parts. But in cars, the moving parts interact with, 2 or 3 interlocking parts. That's about it. Whereas the 50 trillion cells of the human body have perhaps as many as 10 million active types of molecules that interact at an estimated 3 billion chemical interactions a second. So we're talking...
Do you hear that? Did you hear that? I didn't know any of this stuff. 3 billion chemical interactions a second just for silly old me making videos for silly old you to drive your car or wash your dishes or try to go to sleep at night. Think about that. And so then my question is the relevance realization. How far does, these interactions, well, some of them, are they self-organizing? This just staggers the mind. I'm going to play that again because it's so staggering.
About perhaps as many as 10 million active types of molecules that interact at an estimated 3 billion chemical interactions a second. So we're talking about something quite different than the machine model.
We thought markets were complex.
Moreover, each cell is a part of tissues, and tissues parts of organs, systems within subsystems, hormones, circadian rhythms, cycles within cycles, and cycles within seasons, all within the coordinated coherence of an integrated unity of an organic being. We are quite a bit more complicated than anything we use for a model. And it's moreover clear that we are constructed by time. We dwell in time, but we're made by time. The very process of our developmental biology is scaffolded, and the scaffolds are removed, and the architectures remain. You can't simply just pick things out and put things back in without the dynamic processes of development that have formed them. And when we look back at the history of life, it's clear, moreover, that evolutionary process has not been indifferent to the notion of longevity. From bacteria, we gained 1 millionfold in lifespan. From multicellular life, we gained 1,000-fold. Mammals live vastly longer than other creatures on average. Now, some exceptions. Primates live longer, and human beings live longer than the average primate. So nature has actually favored longevity in a complex organism such as the human person. So we may already possibly be the culmination of the combination of organic complexity and longevity. It may be that our medicine is on its way, slowly, but we're getting there, to perfecting the creature in its full inherent lifespan potential. It's a sort of a hard concept to grasp, that we could be a physically perfectible creature for the lifespan we are made for, and that's it. There's no other further options. Some things do get perfected in existence. For example, the spoon. So why not humans? But more deeply, the lifespan has co-evolved with our sense of meaning. the context and contours of our natural limitations. We are psychophysical unity, inseparable in body and mind, located and given meaning within the exigencies of time. We, by our very nature, have a sense of a narrative arc, an autobiographical sense of story about who we are and what we are, why we are. We have the sense that we are somehow encased within our natural lives in the exigencies of their necessities and the opportunities of their relationships, and that it is that within the context of time that gives our life meaning. The Roman physician Galen said, "The physician is only nature's assistant." And by this idea, it could be that our technology will pose the possibility of superhumanization, but might actually end up dehumanizing us, something we need to take quite seriously.
Now, again, apply some of Vervaeke's ideas about category. Well, okay, this category of human, what's its essence? We've been talking about that for, that's what philosophy has been going on and on and on about. This whole talk he gives that Hurlbut gives is just astounding.
The cure could be worse than the disease. Do we really want to stay alive by head transplants or cryopreservation? Do we want to harvest the young in the form of embryonic cells or fetal cells, tissues, or organs just to promote lengthened human life? It's a strange dilemma, isn't it? And yet we also know that by some mystery we are co-creators within the operations of the world, that we, whatever else happened, we operate on the world like no creature ever did. And John Stuart Mill, speaking of the idea that the world was created by a supreme goodness, a beneficent deity, he said, "Nor can any such person, whatever kind of religious phrases he may use, fail to believe that if nature and man are both the works of a being of perfect goodness, that being intended nature as a scheme to be amended, not imitated by man." So we must ask ourselves at the foundation of this discussion, what is the relationship between the given and the good? I agree. Life is to be cherished, and death is to be the ultimate enemy. We have that on good authority. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. Yet it is equally clear it is a spiritual transformation, not a purely technical operation on our corporeal being. I tell you this, brethren, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Martin Luther King said, "If there's nothing you will die for, you've never really been alive." And St. Augustine said, "He hath made us for himself. Our hearts are restless until they rest in him."
It's a great talk. It's a great talk. So we sit atop this stack of complexity or complicatedness of staggering proportions, most of which we knew nothing about in most of human history. And there we are. Yeah, we knew some things. Now the possibility of reason. Here's our friend Rationality Rules, and his clown outfit for his Joker video. Here's one of the problems that I don't really hear the celebrity atheists actually dealing with. If free will is an illusion, so is the idea that we can productively employ reason, thus making reason itself an illusion rather than the hope for humanity. And we see this all the time. And the video, so I did the video that had all the sound problems, including the funny blah, blah, blah voice that Byrne by accident put on both Eric and Peter. But and I want to redo that, and I've been trying to think about ways that I could, in one video process, do short and long videos, because I'm always trying to make my process more efficient because that has to do with the total number of hours that I can spend on this project, so on and so forth. But this whole question of reason and personhood, C.S. Lewis basically said in his book Miracles, they cut the branch off that they're sitting on. They slit their own philosophical throats when they make these moves. And I think Lewis was exactly right, because persons that the things that we consider to be persons are employers of reason. And they do so implicit within an arena where they are real agents, and where their agency is as they have volition, they have desires, and so you really can't have rationality without any of these things. And so then we get to the question of, is personhood an illusion? And down and down and down we go. And can it have a source in non-personhood? And again, maybe that's where Karl and I will talk sometimes, because Karl's question, Karl's question that he comes back to, in some senses, that's a question of my channel that many have, that many are sort of on the horns with, and so I can't answer it or do it for you or dispel it. And I think Karl is right when he says this is something he's going to continue to chew on and work on. I think that's exactly right. You keep working the problem. But as a pastor, I always tell people that God's grip on us is more important than our grasp of Him. I'll just read that again. God's grip on us is more important than our grasp of Him. And that's a really hopeful thought. Actions are tightly compressed, expressed worlds of belief and implicit construals. That's what actions are, and that's again something that I really learned from Jordan Peterson, that when we act, so I take Vervaeke and I take Peterson and I take their stuff and it goes into my noodle and I try and add that to everything else that I've learned. And, actions are these, the world is combinatorially explosive. So we can't, everything is just too great. And so when we act, it's actually, this is all of us coming together in a way. Volition, and your action might be a mess too, because we do it all the time. We miss the mark all the time. But actions are tightly impacted construals. And so as preachers and Peterson all agree, in many ways our actions express and betray our true beliefs rather than the beliefs that we imagine that we hold. And that's true of Christian and non-Christian alike, and that's a point that preachers make all the time to their parishioners and congregations. We are not very rational, really, at all. And yet all of this stuff is built on this amazing world, the glory out there, and the glory in here. The glory, when I was in school, they have this magnification of 10 movie where you just go 10, 10, 10, 10. You just go out, 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 out. And then you go back down and you just go in, all the way down. And now, get to these tiny particles. Say, there's only these few particles and there's these waves. And it's like, the world is too wonderful for me. How must I act? Well, I think, again, as I've said in past videos, the only reasonable way to act is understanding our limits, and that random is the limitation of what we can, of the patterns that we can detect. And the spirit of finesse is the very reasonable, time-tested approach to a world that is far too large and far too great. And there's a portion in this conversation between Karen and Karl and Ira. Ira is a Christian, as is Karen. Karl's still figuring things out. But Ira gives this lovely testimony in this video of his faith and why he believes and how he puts it together. And now again, I'm a Calvinist, and what I like about my Calvinism is it affords me a certain graciousness between Ira's belief and at this point Karl's hesitation. Because, well, faith is a gift. And Ira says that in the video. He's, faith is a gift. and so it's always uncomfortable to necessarily have not been given a gift. But again, I love this possibly apocryphal story of someone that comes up to Saint Augustine and says, I basically, I think I'm reprobate. I think I'm not one of the elect. And Augustine says, then go to a church and get elect. That's Augustine, the father of Calvin's Calvinism. So, it's I have total sympathy for Karl and many like him who say, I just don't feel it. That's okay. That's okay. And I would pastorally, I'd say, fake it till you make it, or fake it till you feel it. But at the same time, I don't want you to be disingenuous or dishonest. I think Job is doing a terrific job of that. Totally honest, working through his questions. And I think actually, unlike people who sort of want to stamp people into these cookie-cutter Christians and get them through, it's of course it's in the church, and outside the church, all of the people wrestling with these questions that are bringing their questions and their ideas and their ponderings into this marketplace of ideas and these conversations that we're having, and doing them in goodwill and blessing each other with their honesty and their truth. It's a beautiful thing, and I think speaking as a pastor, I think God is glorified by it, because it's the kind of interaction that I think glorifies the God who gave us mouths to speak and brains to think and hearts to care. So that's I wanted to do something with this video between Karen and Karl and Ira. I wanted to get that other video with Peter Thiel and William Hurlbut. I don't want to say his name without making a joke, but and I wanted to talk about persons and give you my definition of person. So there it is.